Hello, thanks for joining me for the latest interview with my series with Mint Press called The Most Censored News. I'm Lee Camp, the most censored comedian in America, and I'm going to be speaking today to economist Richard Wolff. I'm proud to call him a friend, but also he's done so much amazing work over the years. He's a professor of economics emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, visiting professor at the graduate program at the New School in New York City. He's the founder of Democracy at Work and host of a nationally syndicated show, Economic Update, many of you have probably heard of. And his latest book is The Sickness is the System, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself. So a lot going on. He has a lot going on, but luckily he's taken some time out, and we're going to get into a little bit of everything over the next hour. So please welcome Professor Richard Wolff.
Thank you very much, Lee. Very glad to be here with you talking again.
Yeah, thanks for being here. I always love speaking to you, and there's never a shortage of topics or ways to cover the various flaws or crises of capitalism. I noticed one of your recent videos was titled, "How Will the U.S. Manage Losing Economic Power?" So I thought that was a good place to start, both how we'll manage it and also why is the U.S. right now losing economic power?
Well, it's in many ways, it's the $64 billion, or I guess nowadays $64 trillion question that we really should be debating, but we aren't. And that's a nice way to get into the first part of the answer. The biggest thing that I notice here in the United States, where I was born and have lived and worked all my life, is that we're mostly in a state of denial. My wife's a psychotherapist, and so I've learned all about denial over the many years of our being together. And it's all classic. It's a wonderful historical, if you're into that, replay. If you go to Great Britain and if you study its history, the last 100 years have been the slow, steady decline of what was once a great empire. The British loved the phrase, "the sun never sets on Britain because we're everywhere." Right. And in a way, they were the most global empire up until about a century ago. World War I was the great change. They weren't anymore. And a new empire emerged, ironically, out of the old one. The United States, a colony of England's, as so much of the world had become, displaced its parent, if you like, a classic psychological issue on its own terms. Yeah. But we, the U.S., became the next empire in the history of the world. And there have been many, the Dutch, the British, the Greek, the Roman. I mean, I could go on. And there's a history, therefore, of the rise and fall of empires. Every single one rose, evolved over time, and died. Every single one. Now, if you want, you can believe that this one, the U.S., will not do what every single other one did. Because we know it was born. We know it's evolved over the last century. Therefore, it really isn't a question whether it's going to decline. It's really only a question of when. And I think we're already there. I think the American economy peaked around the 1970s and 80s. And after that, it was over. It began to decline in a number of ways. And I don't mean to be so verbose about it, but it takes a little history to get the answer to the question. The 1970s are a watershed. They're a watershed because after that, things really changed. First of all, we had an automation transformation. The computer, the extension of the computer, the robot, the extension of the computer, artificial intelligence, have massively destroyed all kinds of jobs for people. And in capitalism, that's the problem of the person who gets displaced. No responsibility is built into the system for the employer who makes the decision how and where and when to fire John and Mary and to substitute a robot, a machine, a computer process, and so on. The 1970s are likewise the time when American corporations, thanks to technology like the jet airplane and the internet, realized that they no longer had to pay the wages, the high wages that an American working class had won over a century of struggle, and that they could move. They could run a factory in Shanghai, China, pretty much as well as they did one in New Jersey, only they would have much lower wages to pay, a desperately poor government eager for jobs to be coming and willing to give all kinds of benefits. And so we had the exodus of jobs for overseas on top of the loss of jobs of automation. Well, these two phenomena, and I could go on, but these two phenomena meant that capitalism did what it always did. It went to where the profits were. If profits were with automation, they did that. If profits were with relocating abroad, they did that. They did whatever they needed to do to succeed at what they are focused on doing, which is maximizing profit. And they made sure that their political representatives in Washington made all of that happen by creating subsidies, tax changes, deals around the world. I mean, when Kissinger and Nixon went to China to open it up as if it were closed, the point was to get the United States in there. The Japanese were already there, the Germans, the Italians, the British, and the Americans didn't want to be left out. They weren't doing China a favor. They were taking care of business. And so they did. And for 40 years, the American working class saw its situation really destroyed. And, you know, in the long run, very dangerous thing to do. You got good 30, 40 years, enormous profits because you were paying low wages in China and you were automating. So it was good for the 10% who own 80% of the stocks. But for the rest of the people, it was dangerous. They couldn't continue the American dream, or to be more accurate, the only way to continue it, since your income wasn't going up, your wages weren't going up, was to borrow yourself to the point where the anxiety about your debts struggles with your anxiety about your job future to give you a case of extreme agita. And, you know, the psychological effects, the destruction of relationships in the family, among the, we're littered with it. The fentanyl crisis, young people overdosing. I mean, wherever you look are the symptoms of a system that can no longer manage its own development. And here's the big one, which is hard to talk about, but it has to be answered. There was a society in the world that had luckily, and luck was a large part of it, escaped being a colony. It was oppressed, but it wasn't anybody else's property, the way most of Latin America was, or most of Africa and most of Asia. And that's the People's Republic of China. And they saw a way to maneuver in what I've just described to make themselves the place to go for an American, or for that matter, anyone, global capitalist. They would give you all the benefits you needed. They will provide you with a disciplined working class. They will provide you with a working class working for wages you could never get away with paying to your own people. They gave you everything. And the result was an explosion of economic growth. And again, make a long story short, for the last 30 to 40 years, they've been on the greatest economic growth story in the history of the world. I mean, Americans don't want to face it, but for the last 30 years, the Chinese growth each year, GDP, is on the order of 6 to 9%. Ours is on the order of 2 to 3%. That's a 3-to-1 rate. And that's been sustained for 30 years, which is why, here comes the last point, we are having extreme difficulties at a time when another society is exploding with its own successes. Doesn't mean they don't have problems. This is not a celebration of civil liberties or anything else. They have their problems, no doubt. All societies do, they're not exempt. But when it comes to economics, here's the hard reality. The difficulties of the American economy is the opposite of what's happening in China. China has become the new empire, the new economic success story. And the Americans are busy denying it, acting as though this hasn't happened, as though the American empire dominates now the way it did in the 20th century. But this is not going to last. It can't. It's already falling apart. For the rest of the world, Americans, again, exempted. We lost the war in Vietnam. We lost the war in Afghanistan. We lost the war in Iraq. I mean, come on. You can pretend you're big Mr. Tough, but your record isn't there. And the economic record is even more explicit. And I don't say this with any pleasure or satisfaction, but I think you have to have some voices that are breaking with the denial story as if none of this made any difference and we are still king of the hill. It's not the case. And as the time passes, the gap between the denial and the reality becomes downright embarrassing. If you go overseas to Europe, which I did recently, you become aware when you talk to intelligent people on all different sides of the political spectrum that they're looking at the United States and shaking their heads, mostly because they see all the symptoms, those I've just listed, and many more, like the Trump administration, like the resurgence of white supremacy, and I could go on, and Americans know it, the level of division, the hostility in the air, all of it. And they say, these symptoms are so many and so continuous, how can you maintain the denial? And the only answer I ever came up with is, look how long the British kept it going. We just saw in the funeral of Queen Elizabeth, the pomp and circumstance that's 1,000 years out of date. What? But people hold on, and the symbols are important.
And they complete with the crown with the Indian diamond on the top of it.
Yeah. Absolutely. And now an Indian prime minister, or a prime minister with roots in India, I mean, a super wealthy man, busily doing the conservative two-step again, as if, and one result of it, which is something we might want to talk about, is that you now see, particularly in Britain, but also in the United States, a resurgence of militancy on the part of the labor movement that we haven't seen for decades. And that, too, is a symptom of a system that can't manage its own contradictions.
Yeah. And I want to get to the labor movement in a bit. In terms of Europe, I read a very interesting article recently about how the U.S. right now is essentially trying to deindustrialize Europe.
Yes.
We're putting them into, back into maybe a vassal state situation, a feudal situation. And we're doing this in a variety of ways. But obviously the touch point, the spark that has lit this fire is the proxy war in Ukraine, which, by the way, the former CIA director, Leon Panetta, said this is a proxy war. And so I wanted to get your take on that, the effort and the goal of deindustrializing Europe, what that could look like, and why would the U.S. want to do that?
Well, the basic answer is the United States understands, to their credit, the leaders here, that their problem is China. All the rest of it is, I don't believe I'm exaggerating. China is the issue. The fight in Ukraine is to weaken one of the major allies of China, which is Russia. And it flows out of that. But in the struggle between the United States and China, in which the United States is clearly economically the aggressor. Uh, Whether you look at the tariff wars of Mr. Trump or the banishing and bans on export and trade with China that the Biden administration has continued, and so on. It's a constant provocation, trying to slow their development, trying to stop their development, frightened that it is being somehow accelerated even by American corporations. All of the old rules that I, as a professor, was told I had to teach, that economics requires the government be kept out of the economy, all of that's thrown out the window. The United States is desperate. So all that ideological argument is gone. The American government is intervening at every step. And so far, the corporate system simply lets the government do that, hoping that somehow it can hold on. There's the denial again to what is historically unfolding. So the Europeans are now saying, correctly in my judgment, that in the United States' effort to struggle with China, one of the key factors, just to give you the example most often discussed in Europe, one of the key issues of struggle is microchips of all kinds that are necessary for all the electronic devices that are becoming the dominant commodities of the modern world. The United States wants to maintain its dominance, wants to repress the Chinese, who have already caught up and gone beyond in some of it and not in others parts of it. They want to do that. And one of the ways they're going to do that, just to give you an example, is they're going to give, as they just did, $50 billion of subsidies if a chip company comes here, produces the chips here, so that the United States doesn't have to buy the chips, especially not from the Chinese, who would otherwise have that advantage. And the Europeans point out, wait a minute, these subsidies mean that a German company now located in Germany, or a French one, or a British one, or a Swedish one, or you name it, are now going to be hurt as victims, collateral damage, if you like, in the struggle between the United States and China, because their companies are going to, here we go, leave Europe and come to the United States to secure the market here, which is still very important, but to participate in the subsidies, because otherwise they will not be able to compete. The companies that are here in the United States getting these heavy subsidies will be able to lower their price because they're getting subsidized, which the Europeans can't match. No European country has the wealth to subsidize its firms. And that used to be a taboo. You don't do that. We created the World Trade Organization in order to block and prevent that. Indeed, the Chinese have filed a claim just a few days ago against the United States for violating the World Trade Organization's rules. You're not supposed to subsidize your industry at the expense of another country, because that undoes the coordination, which was the whole rationale of the World Trade Organization. Okay, the Europeans realize the big players in the world are the US and China. They're fighting. And it's a very dangerous prospect that the Europeans may pay the price. They will be not favored by the Chinese for all the usual reasons, and no longer favored by the United States because the United States can't afford it, has no other way to proceed. When Mr. Biden said, which he did a few weeks ago, when the Europeans complained, your policies involve the deindustrialization of Europe. You are bringing European firms into a situation where they have to go to the United States. They literally have to close in Helsinki, or they have to close in the Rhineland or wherever else and go. And we have no option here. We can't match the subsidies. We can't thumb our nose at China the way you do, because we depend on China in all kinds of ways. The biggest customer for the German miracle of production is China. I mean, they can't survive if you're in that kind of a situation. And the United States, as Mr. Biden revealed, hadn't thought about that. Now, I won't comment on whether that's believable or not, but it shows you that he could even say that you hadn't thought about that. That, for the Europeans, is almost worse than the thing itself, because even if this one can get fixed, the underlying rationality is exposed. The United States is in a struggle. The world, by the way, much of it, believes that the Chinese empire is the next one, and the American is going the way of the British. And wow, that reality is not being changed by anything that's going on at this point, which means I'm confident in telling you that this is a very serious question, and the Europeans are going to have to make very difficult political choices in the immediate future that they're not prepared for. And having denied their own labor movements and leftists the opportunities that they have long wanted, what you're beginning to see with the labor movement is the coming to fruition slowly and painfully, and it's happening in this country too, of an old alliance between social movements and the labor movement coming together. And when that happens, you get enough political strength to change everything. That's why the 1930s were a watershed in this country. And if I can point to an example, in the last national elections in France, the second most important economy in continental Europe, Mr. Macron, the prime minister, had a 3 or 4 percentage points advantage over Mr. Mélenchon, who is the leader of the left in that country, a former communist, etc. But he's only 2 or 3 points behind, and he's gaining, and he's much more of the likely next step in France than the right-wing people are in France. And so, again, when I explain this to Americans, they have no idea. I mean, the media coverage here of Europe is more denial that the second most important political formation in France is now the left. By the way, a unified left that includes socialists, communists, Greens, and independent leftists. They've managed to become a single political movement. It's amazing.
And there's been a large left tide in Latin America that the U.S. is doing everything we can to try and stop. Recently, we effectively, at least so far, it may be overturned by the people in the streets, but so far created 2 coups in 2 days. One in Peru with President Castillo, and the other in Argentina by stopping the vice president from being able to run for president and put a leftist in charge of Argentina. So, the U.S. does everything we can to stop this left tide, some of which you're talking about right now.
Yeah, it does. But I have to tell you, it's having more and more trouble. More and more of the governments in Latin America are either unfriendly to the United States, or when they're friendly, discovering that that's very costly domestically to them. This is a new ball game. Latin American countries, like all the countries of Asia, Africa, they now have a game to play. Because I don't want to paint anybody here as all virtue or all evil, but those countries are now have an option, and the option is China. China is active all over Africa. China is increasingly active in Latin America. It's able to say, we will lend you money, we will buy your outputs, we will make it possible for you and to not have to be a toady to the United States. And the United States has to fit. There's nothing it can do. It does no longer have the kind of wealth that it can simply blow everybody else out of the game. And that's so terribly difficult, especially in a country which became used to the idea that what happens in the rest of the world doesn't really matter. It's all about us. Yeah, well, that's over too. And I think you're going to see the reverberations of this play out. But at this point, I stress the question of denial, which is why I started with it with you, because we're not, it's like going to a therapist or going to AA. I mean, you first have to admit you got a problem before you can make much progress in solving it.
And you speak of the Chinese empire, or working towards a Chinese empire. They are, but of course they're doing it economically, making actual deals with countries that many of those countries, and maybe almost all of them, view as very beneficial to them. Whereas the U.S. has largely done it with with bombs and weapons and 900 military bases around the world, dropping tens of thousands of bombs a year, obliterating just about every country that drops the petrodollar or gets outside of our central banking arms, and then with other countries creating coups. We used to do it with assassination and such, and now it's more often done with lawfare than a bullet, as it was done in Peru. But there's a difference in these two styles.
Yeah, there's a difference in style. Partly that's a constraint on China. I don't know what they would do if they had the military capabilities that the United States has built up. In Europe, there's a kind of sardonic comment I heard quite often, which is that the United States has lost its economic dominance. The United States is in the process of losing its cultural, ideological dominance, but what it still has is its military dominance, and that therefore that things are very dangerous in the minds of the Europeans, for fear that they'll use the thing they still have an edge with, and that we're in for lots and lots of military thing. And the Chinese probably can't compete on that level, and probably know it. They're very slow, if even that, to develop military bases. So they're not, the way it looks to the Europeans.
Well, very, very slow could be opposed to covering the world in military bases.
Absolutely. And I think they hope that you're right, that it's a different way of proceeding and will be appreciated for that. But if one is more cynical, one wonders whether it isn't a more strategic idea about demonstrating that the huge colossus of the United States, and again, the parallel is with the British Empire, used to be the great colossus of the London financial center, just isn't what it was. And you have to give terms to a bank from New York that the Chinese don't require. That you don't have to pay interest at the same rate. You don't have to pay interest in that time. If you can't make a payment, they'll lean and help you. Ghana just had that situation. And it is changing. I mean, the most dramatic, and I'm surprised that more Americans don't kind of get it, is Saudi Arabia. Used to be the bosom buddy of the United States, the oil industry domination and all of that. And they've basically said, okay, the Americans don't want to play with us anymore. The Chinese need energy. We have it. We're going that way. And the recent agreements are staggering. The new agreements between China and Saudi Arabia are providing China with energy, unlimited, cheap energy. It's exactly what's crippling Europe, is now advantaging the Saudis and the Chinese. And you have to see that, because it's a model for everybody else in the world who has anything that the Chinese want, that they may be able to get a better deal. And again, the statistic, last 30 years, China's growing 3 times faster than the US. The most urgent thing for most poor countries around the world is to stop being poor. And the Chinese are the model of how to do that. Even if you don't like this, that, or the other about China, that reality is going to make an enormous difference, as it already does. And pretending otherwise, or consoling yourself that because China has this problem or that problem, therefore you don't have, this is a self-delusion, goes with empire. The Romans, right until the collapse of Rome, referred to all those tribes in the Europe they were losing control of as savages. Okay, that makes you feel better, but they beat you and you're gone and they took over. You know, one of the biggest ones was called the Franks. That's why the country is called France, because it comes from the Franks, not the Romans who took over, but from the savages that undid the Romans.
Yeah, these are all great points, and you know, I didn't. Well, I came up in the U.S. public school system, so I didn't know my history for a while, but I was fascinated to learn that, you know, the British Empire, it faded out over 100, 200 years. And, you know, I was reading something recently about how the Roman Empire, although we call it the fall of the Roman Empire, actually kind of faded over countless years. And so what's happening to the U.S., you know, the fall of the U.S. Empire is, you know, it may not seem like it's overnight, but it seems pretty clear that it's happening. And I think that's a good segue to move to internally what's going on in the U.S. And, you know, we've seen unprecedented strike activity this year, workers standing up in a way that hasn't been seen in many years. And I wonder if you could speak about that, you know, why that is, but then also what does that have to do with the Fed raising interest rates?
Okay. First of all, let me underscore my agreement with you. It is amazing. It is something many of us expected sometime. Many of us hoped for. I certainly was one of them. But we have been disappointed for many decades that it isn't there. The labor movement looks back nostalgically to what was accomplished in the 1930s, creating the Social Security system, the unemployment compensation system, the first time the United States had a minimum wage, a public jobs program that gave work to 14, 15 million unemployed people. It was amazing what the labor movement was able to achieve. And it had very important allies. And if you never learned your history on this one, which I'm sure you didn't since it's been expunged, the allies that they had were two socialist and one communist party that were very large organizations at that time. And that combination, that coalition of a militant labor movement led by the United Mine Workers, but enlarged into what was called the CIO in those days, together with the socialists and communists, they're the ones who forced the New Deal onto the Roosevelt administration. So the labor movement looked back nostalgically. It used to celebrate. What it forgot was it takes militancy, strikes every day in the streets and in the 1930s, which we had to get those things. And if you don't do that kind of militant action, you're not going to get it. This lesson was not learned, or if you like, unlearned in the 50s, 60s, and most of the last 60, 70 years. It's tragic. But it was always in the back of those people's mind. They kind of knew. That's why they were nostalgic about the 30s. They didn't dwell on the socialists and the communists for obvious reasons, but they knew. And that knowledge buried in the back of their minds came to the forefront over the last 30 years. Why? Well, the answer, and here again, denial is the way this is greeted. The last 30 years have been body blows to the American working class that you'd have to be blind not to see or need desperately not to see. Let's go through them.
Right.
Real wages rose for 150 years in this country, from 1820 to 1970. 150 years of every 10 years, if you measure the real wage, that is the amount of money you get adjusted for the prices you have to pay when you spend your money, went up. Unbelievable. No other capitalist country during that 150 years was able to match the United States. That was its explosive time. The capitalists were making so much money, they could give workers a wage increase. Maybe not so big, but they got one, and their standard of living went up. And that was enough most of the time to keep them from questioning the system. When it wasn't, crash of 1929, whoop, here they came. Okay, you were able to do that And then the 1970s came, and you couldn't anymore. Here's a statistic Americans don't want to deal with. The real wage today, that is the amount of money an average American gets measured against the prices he or she has to pay, isn't much more than it was at the end of the 1970s. Wow. We never had that before. The great upward rise of the American working class stopped in the 1970s. And the only way it was masked for the consciousness of the American people was by borrowing. We became everybody has a credit card, everybody borrows for their car, for their home, for their daily expenses. And then the new one, 20 years old now, for school, college. You have to borrow up the wazoo to get a degree that's worth less than it ever was before. A horrible contradiction, but again, denial. We try not to talk about it. So the American working class has been really whacked by the end of what it assumed was an American birthright. This notion that America is exceptional. Well, it's silly on one hand, but for 150 years, you could come to believe it, as Americans did in large numbers. Look what we got here. And you masked the end of it in the 1970s by this explosion of credit that we have. But now it's over. 2008 was the crash of the credit bubble, and we haven't been able to figure out any other way. Therefore, it's stagnation, but stop. Then you have the crash of 2008, which is a lesson to the American people that this instability of capitalism, the up and down cycle that threatens us all, is alive and well, hasn't been put into the past, hasn't been reformed out of our lives. It's right here. And look what damage it was able to do in 2008, 9, and 10. Barely coming out of that, we get hit with a failure of our public health system. I mean, again, if I can use the model of the comparison with China, China has 4 times the population we do. They have 30 to 50,000, depending on how you count, deaths from COVID. We have over 1 million. They have 4 times the people and a tiny fraction of the death. They're a poor country. They don't have the developed medical system we do in many ways. Yet, what is going on? And we decimate our people with that. And before the end of the so-called COVID pandemic, we whack our working class with an inflation, which they can't cope with. And now the rising interest rates on top of you can't keep whacking your working class for decades and then be surprised that they finally say, whoa, stop. This is not tolerable. And whether they express that by being crazy on the Capitol steps on January 6th, or whether they express it by discovering socialism or many other things, this is built in to what you're doing. And I think the American working class is in fact waking up, is in fact recognizing that whether a Republican is in the White House or a Democrat, this destruction of the working class keeps on going. You know, it may be a little less aggressive when the Democrats are in. On the other hand, less aggressive is not what the working class needs. A reversal of the last 30 years is what it needs and wants, and it can see they're not getting that. They're not getting the undoing of Trump's tax giveaways. Democrats promised it, don't do it. Then you see Biden, forcing the railroad workers to work against their own wishes. That's called forced labor. That's actually illegal, what the United States is doing there. Another conversation. Anyway, my big point is I see this as an American working class, which is telling its employer class, don't push any further. We are not. In Europe, this is done in an organized way. The unions are very powerful. They are national. And they basically say, okay, we're going to have a strike next Tuesday, next Thursday, and next Saturday. And we're letting you know it's all going to come to a stop. And just understand, That's 3 days out of the week. If you don't do something, 2 weeks later, we're going to do 4 days out of the week. And 2 weeks, we can't do that in this country for reasons of our labor movement. But we are doing it in our upside down way. We're letting the employers know, whether it's a Starbucks fighting for $15 an hour or the railway workers. I'm a professor at the new school. We just went out, an adjunct professor. We just went out on strike. We had a strike. If you know anything about American academics, they're probably the last ones to come to that determination. Yet in California, they went out in a big way, and they have in many, and more colleges are coming. I can assure you, I'm in touch with many professors who I never expected, who are now angry as they discover what has happened to them, which they were in denial of too. So I believe we're going to have many more. And if we replace the Democrats with Republicans who are more aggressive, it's just going to provoke all of this more. And I think you saw an election last month in which the employers were busy. They don't want the stiff arm of the Republicans because they're afraid of what it might now provoke. And I think already you're beginning to see the anxiety in which a labor movement could do things directly to the employers that people outside of the immediate employment relationship can't do.
And the second part of the question was, I was wondering if you can connect this to the Fed raising interest rates, because traditionally that has caused a recession. I mean, we're now basically in a recession, and it seems that the ruling class is hoping for a recession that puts the power back in the hands of the ruling class.
Well, in my judgment, the ruling class is now very frightened and very divided. And I'm not so clear which way they're going to go. Are there people who subscribe to what you just said? Absolutely. Most of them, when I talk to them, and I should be, mention to you that I come out of the American elite system. My classmate, when I got my PhD in economics at Yale, my classmate in my classes was Janet Yellen. I know these people. I know
you're a class traitor.
Yes, I'm a bit of something went wrong, as some of my friends said. What happened?
Two of my favorite people to talk to are you and Hedges. I think you're both Harvard, right?
Yes. Harvard. I went to Harvard and Yale. So anyway, I went to all those places, and I know these people. Many of them, they really are in denial. These are often nice people. They have a good heart. Many of them are liberals. They care about inequality. They really do. Not enough to do anything, but their verbalizations are sincere. Janet Yellen is an example. She is upset about inequality, but she disconnects all of that from what she's actually doing. And I don't mean to pick on her. It's a general comment on them.
It's a willful ignorance that I see in a lot of liberal friends I have.
Yep, exactly right. And if you knew them well personally, and you had enough beers, all of that could come out, and might be therapeutic for them. But anyway, the Federal Reserve, it's traditional. It's what we teach in every class. If you have an inflation, it's because businesses are raising prices. You'd be amazed how many people don't seem to get that. Workers do not set prices, ever, anywhere. That's not part of what an employee does, nor does the government. The overwhelming majority of prices are set by a particular group of people, the employers. That's about 1% of our population, if even that much. So an inflation right away ought to be understood as an act by a tiny minority that everybody else has to live with. And it ought to be upsetting to people, because that's a minority that nobody elected making a decision that impacts everybody. Number one. Number two, what do you do about that if you don't want it? Well, the answer is capitalist societies have come up with a variety of ways. One way, only one of them, is called raising interest rates. And here's the logic. If you raise interest rates, which the government can do, then both individuals and businesses will borrow less money because it's more expensive to do that if the interest rate is high. And if businesses and individuals, you, me, and the local company making banana splits, if they don't borrow as much, then they won't have as much to spend. And the idea is the employers, seeing that the potential buyer hasn't got as much to spend because interest rates are higher, will now moderate the raising of prices. Nice story. Does that sometimes work like that? Sometimes. But there's no necessity. The employer class can simply respond by saying, okay, if a whole bunch of people can't borrow, can't afford to pay the higher interest rates, it's not our problem. We will become a smaller company. Okay, we'll sell fewer things. We'll charge more prices. And the irony is that the raising of interest rates will then provoke the very employer class to raise prices more. When you have a rising price level with fewer and fewer productions, fewer jobs, we have a word for that, stagflation. You know why we have a word for it? Because it's happened repeatedly to us. It's not a weird possibility. Any honest discussion of what's going on now would have to talk about, whoa, we could have a stagflation. That's even worse than what we have now. Now, let me go back. I said it's only one. Let me give you an example of two other ways to deal with an inflation other than raising interest rates. Number one, the path chosen by a conservative Republican president, Richard Nixon, on the 15th of August, 1971. He's the president. He goes on radio and TV and he says, we have a terrible inflation, 10, 11% already, I think, by that time. We have to do something, and I'm going to do it. As of tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock, any business, any employer who raises a price on anything will be arrested, and we're going to put him in jail. President, conservative, tricky Dick Nixon. Any worker or union that pushes the wage up, same story. That's why it was called a wage price freeze, because that's what the government was doing. Worked like a charm.
Yeah.
It was originally set for 3 months. It was extended more than once, twice, I think. Why? Because it stopped the inflation. Now, businesses hated it because it took away the freedom of a free enterprise to set whatever price it can get. Yeah, that's what it did. That's how it solved the problem. Well, I'm not suggesting that there aren't problems with wage price freeze. There are. There are problems with raising interest rates. There are problems with every solution. Talking about the fact that it had problems is saying nothing. But we didn't even do that. We had no major politician, not in the Federal Reserve, not in the Republican Party, and not in the Democratic Party, say one word about what was done the last time we had a fast inflation that frightened us by a conservative Republican. Amazing. That's called ideological spin on a level that ought to frighten you. Here's the second example. It's early 1940s. The United States is getting ready to enter World War II. So it's moving all of its railroad and storage and factories to stop producing consumer goods the way they once did, the American people, but instead produce for the war. Uniforms, guns, bullets, planes, ships, all of that. And President Roosevelt calls in the economists and said, this is what we have to do to fight the war. Is this a problem? One of them, John Kenneth Galbraith, who later became my teacher, which is why I know this story, he's an advisor to the president. He goes to the president and he says, yeah, you're going to have a doozy of an inflation. Why, says the president. Well, everybody in America who wants to consume is going to keep wanting to consume. But you're saying that the supply of consumer goods is going to drop like a stone because we're producing for war instead of for the public, or at least a large part of what we used to produce for public consumption is now going to be made for the military. And if you let the market work, here's what's going to happen. There's going to be a shortage of, I'll pick something, ice cream. Okay, what's going to happen is the poor man and wife are coming with their kids to the park and they want to buy ice cream cones for their kids. The rich man and his wife are coming. They want to buy ice cream cones for their kids. But there are not enough cones because a lot of the production is for war. So the rich man says, I'll give you $2 more per cone. The poor man hurt. So, okay, I want for my kid. Oh, I'll give you $4. In other words, prices will get bid up by the rich, who will walk away with the scarce consumer goods. And Kenneth Galbraith, who called himself a socialist in those days, he dropped that later. Anyway, Galbraith says to President Roosevelt, you want to fight a war with a weakened home base? You want poor people to be bitterly angry that they're frozen out while rich people can get the ice cream for their kids? You want that? I don't think so. So you better not let the market do its job. You better not let prices get bid up by those who can afford it when there's a sacrifice we're all supposed to make. Roosevelt agreed. So guess what happened? They said from now on, for the following list of commodities, we're not going to allow the price mechanism to work. We're going to say, if you have money to buy the following items, and I'll give you a list in a minute, doesn't matter. We're going to say to an employer, if you sell any of these items to a person for money, we're going to arrest you. You can only sell them if the person has a ration card or a ration ticket. The government printed and distributed in America ration cards. And you know how they did it? If you had a large family, a lot of kids, you got a lot of cards for milk. That was one of the items. And if you were an elderly couple whose kids had grown up and left, you got very few milk tickets. Milk, sugar, coffee, gasoline, meat, I could go on. We're all rationed in America. That's how you avoided an inflation. And guess what you could do to inflation now? The exact same thing. Not a word. This little history I gave you just now, not a word.
Whether sounds very anti-capitalist of them.
Yes. and the irony is, of course, that raising interest rates is as discriminatory as the inflation. When prices go up, it's worse for the poor, for the middle class. The rich don't care if it costs another 10, 20, 30%. That's what it means to be rich. And to raise interest rates, the same thing. It's just raising another price. In this case, the price of money, of borrowing money. So again, it discriminates against the middle and the poor. You keep doing this to the working class. Don't be surprised if you begin to get deeper and deeper rumblings of, we're not taking this anymore. We're not going to allow you to do this. Yeah, he stopped the railway workers from striking, but I am amazed across the spectrum of American labor, including very conservative building trades and others. They are very angry at Mr. Biden. That's going to cost the Democratic Party. There's a whole change in attitude as they begin to see that President Biden is former Senator Biden, who comes from the state of Delaware, which is the home of most American corporations, because it is one of the most corporate-friendly states, et cetera, et cetera. It's not that they didn't know this before, but they're drawing the conclusions. And again, as I see beginnings of coalition between political movements and the labor movement, as they recognize that they need each other, that they recognize that they share the desire for pretty big changes, people like me are hopeful in a way we haven't been for a while. And let me tell you, it's a good place to be.
I think part of what I'm hearing is capitalism does not really solve problems when push comes to shove. When we're in desperate, when we're in crisis, when people really need it. I mean, we've got a housing crisis right now where people can't afford rent, they can't afford to get a house, and yet you have 17 million. At least that's the last estimate I could find. 17 million empty housing units sitting around America, and yet no one can afford an apartment. That does not sound like a feasible system. And so maybe in these last 5 minutes, you can use that as a segue to your book titled "The Sickness is the System."
Yeah, I think what Americans have been denying for a long time is now being imposed on our consciousness, that it isn't just this problem or that one, that there is a systemic problem. It's like going to a doctor and saying, I have my arm hurts or my leg hurts or I have headaches or whatever it is. And the doctor, after treating you for a while and doing the usual tests, has bad news for you. You've got to do something basic. Your weight is wrong, or your metabolism doesn't work, or your diet is you have to deal more basically with your whole body as a system. That's where I think we're going. That's what I think is coming. I'm amazed at how many people are now able to say the word. When I wrote a book 10 years ago and I put the title Capitalism, I was advised by my publisher not to put that word there. I did anyway, because the publisher said that'll kill the sales. People get uncomfortable. That's gone. Everybody's talking about capitalism now.
Yeah.
And I think these are signs, since many of the conversations are quite critical and seem perfectly comfortable about. That's a recognition that the problem is systemic. And for me, that's the conclusion I reached earlier in my life. And everything that has happened in the last 30, 40 years confirms for me that this law or that law, this president or that does not get at the core problem we have refused to deal with. If you have an economic system that puts a small minority of people in a exclusive, powerful position, they're going to take care of themselves. Why are the rich people so often CEOs? Hello, it's because they sit at the top of the corporate pyramid and they take care of themselves. And the people who put them there, those are the major shareholders. That's why the rich are overwhelmingly major shareholders, or the CEOs elected to be that in the corporations that run this economy. If you do that, you can't then be surprised that there's growing inequality. Of course there is. That's what they do. And they're not there because they're smart. I mean, you should watch Elon Musk for 15 minutes as you become clear about that. And there are many other examples. Why are we doing that? It used to be we had kings, and the king used to say to all of us, I'm the king. I'm in touch with God, and you're lucky I'm the king, and I'll take care of you. And man, if you ever got rid of the king, you'd be lost. At a certain point, we showed the king a particular finger, and that was the end of that story. But we allow the kings to still be with us, but they played a game. They changed their name and moved. They're now called CEOs. They sit inside the productive operations of our society, the factories, the offices, the stores, and they run them like any king ever did. They do what they want, how they want, when they want. They make their decisions and they impose them on the mass of people. And they say to the mass of people, you're lucky I'm the CEO here because I know how to manage the company. And that's why your job is secure. And that's why your income is secure, until it isn't. And then you'll blame something else. And maybe you'll leave as the CEO and put another jerk in your place, the way kings used to pass away and give it to their son or their cousin or somebody else in the line of. The problem was never who was the king. The problem was the system, monarchy, and we got rid of it. And we said the way the society has to be run is we have to run ourselves. My answer is that's what capitalism is. It's that last system of a few controlling the many that's got to go. Just like a few masters control the slaves. and a few lords control the serfs. We have a few employers that control the employees. Same problem, overwhelm those other systems. It's time that we understand we need to do the same thing.
And that's what people will get from your book, huh? Is the call to arms that you just put forward. I
I
like
hope
it.
so.
Arms, being a figurative word there, but
Yes.
thank you so much for joining me, Professor Wolff, Richard, and it's an honor to talk to you. And I hope you have great holidays and enjoy the cutthroat consumerism of this holiday season.
Yes, I do that as much as I can, but I really meant it a few moments ago when I said the level of people aware, those that respond to what we do, being a constant source of inspiration for me and support, make me feel better about what's coming up with all of the problems than I have in quite a while. So I don't want people to despair. It's always a mixture of scary, dangerous things, but it's always important to remember that if you look carefully, opportunities and progressive things are there as well.
Thank you. And I hope to see you again soon.
Same here, Lee. Thank you.
All right. That was Professor Richard Wolff. Always a pleasure to talk to him. So much information we get through. Never seems like there's enough time to get to it all, though. But folks, I hope you've enjoyed this interview series that I've been doing. You just saw Richard Wolff. I've had Chris Hedges, Scott Ritter, Stephen Donziger, Vijay Prashad, these wonderful, impressive people that it's great to speak with. If you want to see this keep going, because there's no guarantee that this interview series will be able to continue, I hope you will become a member at patreon.com/behindtheheadlines. If you want to sign up there right now, we're still working on building that up. So it doesn't have, a bunch of perks and things listed, but if you want to go ahead and sign up, as we build it up, we will certainly, make sure that you get those things. It's part of Mint Press. So also support Mint Press News as well. And of course, another part of this that I do is a show called The Most Censored News. That is, it's a written show with me, not a live stream. And I just had a new one on AFRICOM, the truth behind AFRICOM that the Pentagon does not want you to know. The evidence and the proof of what they're doing in Africa has come via leaks, documents, FOIA requests, etc. I kind of put it all together in a 15-minute episode. You can get that as well at youtube.com/behindtheheadlines. Make sure you click subscribe. And Friday, what is that, tomorrow? Man, I'm lost. Tomorrow, I'll be talking to Margaret Kimberly, amazing writer, activist, speaker. She's with Black Agenda Report and does so many other things. But don't miss that tomorrow at noon Eastern as well, right here at youtube.com/behindtheheadlines. Thanks again and keep fighting.